Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is a revisit of an older Titan build, famously called Hammerbonk Titan, and how it's showcasing with SLAYER 3.0. Before we get into the build, be sure to like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content like this. Thank you in advance. Getting right into things, SLAYER 3.0 incredibly shook up the entire playstyle sandbox for all SLAYER builds in PvE, and with Hammer Titan specifically, it brought it to one of the best PvE builds in the entire game to arguably the best across all three classes. I'm not kidding when I say that this build is deserving of a nerf even more so than it already was in the past. This build does everything from a DPS build that it already did before, to now having increased survivability, a support style, as well as ability regen that just didn't have before without extreme mod investment. It literally took anything that could be considered a downside to the previous versions of this build in past seasons and made it intrinsically part of the class. Especially when we combine it with Sunspots in general, it makes us one of the most unstoppable builds in the entire game, and I cannot wait to show it to you guys. Starting off again, we are on SLAYER 3.0 Sunbreaker. I'm personally using a Hammer of Soul, but if you want to use Burning Maul, you totally can. There's really no difference between the two because we're not really going to be using our super that much. I'm also using Hammer Throw, which is crucial for Hammerbonk Titan, as believe me when I say this, it is a million times better than Hammer Strike. Trust me on this one. We're also using Soul Invictus, which is essentially the more toned down version of Sunspot, as a lot of the intrinsic effects on Sunspot are now actually effects on SLAYER 3.0, like Restoration or Radiant, for example. We're also using the Roaring Flames aspect, which is the exact same intrinsic effect found on Burning Maul in previous seasons, and it functions more or less the exact same way. As far as fragments go, please keep in mind that at the time of this filming, there are already a few fragments being looked at and potentially even reworked, so always check up on the most recent patch notes to stay up to date on what may or may not have changed. However, for the most part, this should still all work perfectly fine as you're seeing it. Even if a few of these do get disabled, trust me when I say this, this build is way too crazy as it is to be considered unviable by any standards. The first one is Ember of Benevolence, which essentially grants us increased ability regen anytime that we apply Restoration, Cure, or Radiant to an ally, which we'll be doing very easily as you'll see later on. Next is Ember of Blistering, which whenever we defeat targets with our Solar Ignition, it grants us grenade energy, helping again with that ability regen that typically wasn't found on Hammerbonk Titan. Ember of Solace, which allows Radiant and Restoration effects applied to us to have increased duration, a nice quality of life change for us. And the most important is Ember of Torches, where whenever we get a powered melee attack against combatants PvE, it makes us and our nearby allies radiant. And for those wondering, Radiant is actually the Sun Warrior damage buff that was previously found on Soul Invictus, now intrinsically part of SLAYER 3.0, meaning this is a 25% weapon damage buff for us and our allies across the board. And considering the fact that we have one of the highest DPS playstyles in the entire game with our melee, this will not be hard to do. And this, of course, then plays into Ember of Benevolence and just all the other abilities that we have and makes this build absolutely insane. So you remember, if we then get Ember of Torches and apply Radiant, we then get our ability regen back. We also use Sunspots to actually get Restoration, which is some of the best intrinsic healing in the entire game. It puts stuff like Well of Life to absolute shame, and I'm not kidding when it makes you almost invincible because you're healing off damage so fast and it cannot be interrupted. You are constantly healing. There's no damage chunk that stops your healing for the set amount of seconds you have it. You are constantly healing, and it is incredibly quick. Before I get into the mods today, I do want to say that if at any point you realize the playstyle isn't for you, you want to spec into more damage, you want to do a more support focused build, you want to have more ability spam rather than just pure damage or just survivability, you can totally change that, because when I tell you that this build literally does it all, it literally does everything you could want out of a build in the game all at once. So if you look at this and say, well, I really want more damage from this, you can totally use something like Worm God over SYNTHOCEPS, and although there's a little bit more of commitment with that, you could definitely get more damage out of it. Or say if you want to use something like Heart of Inmost Light and spec into more ability spam rather than just pure damage, you can totally do that too, as well as mods. For example, if you want to rock something like Well of Tenacity, double down on Titan Bulk this season, you can totally do that as well. Another quick note then is that Resilience got a major buff at the start of Season 17. At Tier 10 Resilience, we are now getting a 40% damage resistance across the board for anything that can deal damage to us in PvE. This is absolutely insane, because Resilience, which was pretty much worthless until this season, is now giving us near constant Well of Tenacity levels of damage resistance across the board. And like I mentioned earlier, if you want to stack this with Well of Tenacity, with Protective Light, with other damage resistance mods, you can totally do that, and they do stack, meaning that you can be even bulkier than you could before. And something like this on this build, when combined with the healing effects with Restoration and all these other effects, such as with Well of Tenacity, Protective Light, or just Resilience mods, you can have just as much survivability as a Bastion, Bubble, Offensive Bulwark Titan. You can have just as much survivability as some of the tankiest builds out there, while still having some of the best DPS in the entire game, all while supporting your fire team, as well as having incredibly good ad clear and ability regen. This build literally does it all, and I would not be surprised if this gets heavily nerfed in the coming weeks. So our first mod for today is Elemental Charge. Very simple with this build. Anytime we pick up a solar elemental well, it gives us 2 stacks of charge with light. A normal elemental well that doesn't match our subclasses is going to give us 1. I'm also using hands-on just because we get bonus super energy on melee kills, and since we're going to be basically spamming our melee charge for the entire time we're using this build, this will get us our super back really quickly. And again, with Roaring Flames then buffing our super damage as well as SYNTHOCEPS, our super actually has really good ad clear and damage potential itself, so there's really no harm in using your super with this build. Getting into our exotic for today is SYNTHOCEPS. Again, if you want to do something like Worm God, the effect is more or less the same. It is a little bit more of a commitment due to the time restriction of Burning Fist, but you are effectively doing double the damage. With SYNTHOCEPS though, we have increased melee lunge range, and then whenever we're surrounded by 3 more targets within 15 meters, we have increased super and melee damage. And again, this does buff our throwing melee, making it one of the best damaging abilities in the entire game, even outpacing heavy weapon DPS. First mod is Bountiful Wells. Essentially anytime we spawn a solar elemental well, we're going to get a second one along with it. I'm also using Impact Induction because causing any damage with our melee attack is going to give us grenade energy, which again is something we're going to be doing nearly constantly, meaning that we're going to have a lot of grenade regen naturally occurring along with Impact Induction, and then Fastball and Resilience for, again, quality of life changes. For our chest piece, I'm using Melee Wellmaker. Again, getting a power melee combat and final blow allows us to spawn a elemental well with Bountiful Wells. This then spawns us 2 solar elemental wells. This is incredibly easy because again, our hammer is mainly one-shotting anything outside of bosses and mini bosses, and effectively enabling us to have constant elemental well generation with this that we, along with our fire team, can benefit from. I'm also rocking 2 resist mods, mainly Concussive Dampener and then the Armor of the Dying Star, which gives us damage resistance to solar and void damage. However, if you want to spec into reserves and use a certain weapon with this build, you totally can. Again, if you want to focus on different aspects, and different mods will benefit you better than just plain damage resistance mods, definitely go for that. Onto our legs, I'm using Striking Light. Whenever we're charged with light and we get a melee final blow, it'll consume 1 stack of charged with light and generate an orb of power for our allies. This is mainly focusing onto the support build because out of everything that this build does, I feel like this is kind of the weakest part of it, which is saying something whenever we're, again, having some of the best survivability in the entire game, alongside some of the best DPS, ad clear, ability synergy, and you name it. This again is helping our teammates by just spawning orbs of power nearly constantly, and also enabling any kind of builds that they have revolving around orbs of power to benefit from that as well, or just simply getting their super back faster. And I'm also using 2 Invigorations, which reduces our melee cooldown each time we pick up an orb of power ourselves. And then finally onto our mark, we're using Well of Life. Again, the restoration completely outperforms Well of Life, but just simply stacking the 2 makes it so you almost can't even take minor damage from stuff like Thrall or Exploding Screeves, even some majors potentially, depending on the activity you're in. This just effectively stacks on top of that and nullifies any minor damage you might receive. It's absolutely insane how much you can actually tank with this build whenever you're considering the 40% damage resistance naturally found with the tier 10 resilience, with Well of Life, and with Restoration. You can effectively just shrug off anything outside of boss damage, and it's absolutely insane when you consider everything we're doing with the build. However though, if you don't want to use something like this and you want to use something, say like Bountiful Wells or Well of Ordnance for better ability synergy, totally go with that as well. I'm also using Molten Overload just because to help stagger Overload champions, but if you wanted to use something like Revitalizing Blast, which whenever you stun a champion, it causes them to ignite and shuts off your shield regen delay, or if you want to use something like Withering Heat, whenever you cause damage with the solar ability to a champion, it weakens them for a little bit, you can totally use that as well. I'm personally using Bomber just again, helping with that ability synergy with our Grenade whenever we use our class ability. If you do want to use any kind of seasonal mods though, highly recommend something like Solar Fulmination, where your ignitions do increase damage and have an increased radius. Just a nice benefit kind of to everything of the playstyle here, because again, we are still using Sunspots. Or if you wanted to, Rays of Precision is also a really good one. Anytime that we are Radiant, which is almost constantly, Solar Precision Final Blows cause enemies to ignite, meaning that this works well with any solar weapon, as well as stuff like Flame Harvesting, where if we use a solar exotic weapon, it creates solar elemental wells. Again, benefiting this build as a whole, say like something with Sunshot or with Hiko's Divination. This works really well, but you can already see just how diverse this playstyle is whenever we're having so many different effects intrinsically found on the subclass. Onto our weapons, again, it's entirely up to you. I'm personally speccing into melee and support rather than just pure weapons, although we do have some interesting choices with this season. My first pick is Tractor Cannon, which is just simply a nice debuff for actually helping our hammer damage. This is mainly for any kind of boss, mini-boss, or champion damage with our hammer, where we just kind of want to eliminate them as fast as possible. This is applying a 30% debuff on top of all the other stacks of melee damage we're having, as well as just suppressing enemies in general. It's a really good ad clear tool as well if you just have a lot of minor ads and just want to separate them all at once, as it is an area of effect shot. It's a really good PvE tool, and especially for actually applying that debuff for increased hammer damage, it's something I highly recommend. The other weapon I'm using is RETRACED PATHO, which is the trace rifle from Dares of Eternity in the 30th anniversary event. Normally, I wouldn't be caught dead using a trace rifle, especially in PvE. However, at the start of Season 17, they got a 25% weapon damage increase in PvE, and whenever you combine this with something like One for All, as well as a minor spec, this thing absolutely shreds, and especially if you combine it with, say, stuff like Path of Burning Steps, or just the Radiant effect in general, or even Font of Might that you can even use with this build. This thing does a ton of damage, and I cannot recommend it enough. If you do not have one of these already, give it a try with solar builds, you won't regret it. Besides that, you can really use whatever weapons you want. I can also recommend something like Parasite, just because that times 20 stack does a ton of damage, and again, if you combine this with Radiant or with Font of Might, it makes it even better. But there are a ton of other weapons here that you can use. Again, Sunshot and Tikus are always good options as well. Something like Tarba is absolutely incredible in PvE, especially with the perk going. But you can see that with all these recommendations, this build is really open to whatever you want to use, simply because it does everything. Again, we're having some of the best DPS in the entire game, we're having some of the best survivability and natural healing found intrinsically on the subclass that we're just making even better with any kind of damage resistance or natural healing effects. We're having incredible ad clear because, again, our hammer is one-shotting basically everything, and Sunspots and Ignitions are there to clean everything else up, which then helps us play into our ability regen, which then helps us benefit our fire team and support, especially with stuff like Strike and Light, where we're just essentially always genning orbs for our fire team. Again, if there's any certain aspect of this build you want to spec into, you can totally do that, and I'm mainly showing this build because use it while you can. This, in my opinion, is the best build in PvE currently in the game. There are no downsides of this build, and even in past seasons when Bonk Titan was still doing this much damage, there were issues with it, like the lack of survivability because we had to spec into Melee Wellmaker, especially in high-end content. We would often just get absolutely destroyed if we couldn't kill things fast enough, and that meant that we had to have as much damage as possible. You had to use a 1-2 punch shotgun, you had to use a tractor cannon, you had to use Melee Wellmaker, you had to use Well of Life. Now you don't, because the healing naturally found on the subclass puts Well of Life to shame. And again, you can double down on it and have both those healings going at the exact same time and just have it be absolutely insane, but you don't have to. Another thing was the commitment to hammer, because if you lost your hammer, you lost effectively all your DPS, your survivability, your ad clear, etc., and you're effectively left with weapons that only benefited your hammer damage and weren't really excelling in ad clear. Well, now we can do that and still have basically the exact same hammer damage. And again, if you wanted more hammer damage itself, use something like Wormgod Caress. If that's not really your thing, you could definitely use something like Heart of Inmost Light and use ability spam, combine that with, say, Reaping Wellmaker and Well of Tenacity, and get that additional 50% damage resistance whenever you pick up a Void Well. There are so many options you can do with this build, and it's still one of the best, if not the best builds in all of PvE. I fully expect this build to be heavily nerfed at some point in the season, because it's literally, in my opinion, the best from here. I'm certainly going to be bringing you guys other Solar 3.0 content and other Destiny builds this season, and I already have another Solar 3.0 Titan build I'm working on that's a little bit different of a playstyle, but still just as fun. But I'm mainly bringing this to you because if this does get nerfed, use it while you can, and I would not be surprised if this got nerfed. 100% try this build out, you will not regret it. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate the continued support on these builds. Again, if you liked the video, be sure to like it, subscribe for more Destiny content like this, and let me know down in the comments what builds you want to see. I'm already currently working on another Titan Solar 3.0 build, as well as a Hunter build featuring some of the highest damaging supers in the entire game. Stay tuned for that as well. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.